So this morning we're going to be in Matthew 24, and long ago, back in the end of December, beginning of January, I planned this whole Matthew thing out. And we are coming back to Matthew after talking about it in the beginning of 2018 when I first got here. And so I went back and looked at everything we talked about that first time around, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss some of the bigger things, and I also wanted to make sure that we didn't skip things we had already skipped before, and trying to balance those things out. And I think we ended up with something like 60 or 70% new stuff and 30 or 40% old stuff. And as I looked at it and got to this week's, I thought to myself, what was I thinking? Why did I put Matthew 24 in here? And then as I started reading about Matthew 24, the first commentary I opened to look in, it was the Expositor's Bible Commentary. And the first thing it said at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24 was, this may be the most difficult chapter in all of Scripture to interpret. Along with, and the next two it listed off were the two parallels in Mark and Luke of the same story. And I thought again to myself, what have I done? Now, I will tell you a couple things as we lead into this. First of all, it cannot be covered in 20 minutes. And so this is not going to be exhaustive by any means. Maybe exhausting, but it won't be exhaustive. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the high points of it. We're going to realize there are a lot of different ways that people look at this. And there are a lot of ways that people have taken this chapter and run in all kinds of different directions. There are fictional books, there are movies, there are whole movements that have come out of this chapter. And there is a lot that has been misread in all of this. Now, I do not pretend to be the lone expert on Matthew 24. So I would encourage you, if this is something that intrigues you and interests you, read more into it. Now, at the same time, as you're reading about it, make sure you're cautious about where you're reading, because people go all kinds of different directions on this. Listen to other sermons on this, other classes on it. There's a lot of material out there, but there are some things I think we can gain from it as we look today. And I think, by the way, if you have one of the modern translations, they tend to do a pretty good job with the way these sections are broken apart as to what they're about. Because as we're going to look at here in a minute, it's not just one topic that Jesus is talking about throughout this chapter. So we'll start in verse 1. It says that Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." So there's a lot to unpack here in the first few verses, but mainly what I want you to see here is there are three different questions that they're asking. And they're asking basically this. First of all, when will these things be? Now, if you'll remember what Jesus has just talked about, it's the destruction of the temple. And he's talked about the fact that this is going to be destroyed at the level that there's not going to be a stone left on another stone. And quite honestly, as you think about that prophecy that he gives here, it seems pretty unlikely if you're to look at the building. Now, we don't have the advantage of being able to see the temple. We've seen lots of artist renditions and models and all those kinds of things. But it was quite a thing to look at. It had a shine to it just when the sun would hit it. It was very large. And even the stones that were there to put it together, some of those stones were like the size of semi-truck trailers. They weren't quite as tall, but they were the length of that. And so if you could imagine the size of these stones that would have had to be brought into place to build this temple, the idea that there would be any destruction that could cause those stones, none of them to be on each other anymore. We have watched, unfortunately, on the other side of the world over the last few weeks, a lot of destruction going on in Ukraine. And we have seen what bombs do and how there is a building that was there and then what's left of that building. But even in that, you see a lot of shells of buildings that are left there. And so when Jesus says this is all going to be wiped out just to a level you cannot comprehend, that's quite a thing to say, and yet not too far down the road from when Jesus says this, all that stuff is going to happen. Now, secondly, they say, what will be the sign of your coming? So they want to know, okay, if he's going to leave and he's going to come back, what's that going to look like? How are we going to know it's on the way? And then third, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So they're asking three different questions. Now, the way they're asking it, though, I think says something about what they think is going to happen, which is they likely thought that these are individual events that are going to take place closely together. So they may think maybe all of this happens simultaneously. Temple's destroyed, he comes back, judgment comes, the end of everything. All of this is going to happen at once. Or maybe they think the temple's going to be destroyed, and that's going to be the thing that's kind of the first sign that we're going to recognize that he is on the way back pretty quickly, and then at that point, judgment's going to happen, the world's going to be destroyed, we're all going to move on to eternity. Whatever they may think, I don't think they believe these things are going to happen a big distance apart, which is where the struggle comes for us. Because a lot of times people will look at this chapter and they will think all of this is about the end of time. And it's not. Jesus has asked 3 different questions, and he is answering those questions throughout. Now, what makes this difficult, and by the way, as we look at these 3 questions, it was funny to me, the one commentary I read talked about how this is the most difficult chapter to interpret. The next commentary I read, Burton Kaufman's commentary on the book of Matthew, says that if you can get the grasp that it's about these 3 questions, and he is answering throughout the chapter these 3 questions in different ways, this is actually pretty easy to interpret. Now, I don't know which one of them to believe. I think that it probably falls somewhere in between. But if we can see it this way, the trouble comes in. He answers these questions throughout the chapter at different times and sometimes at the same time. And so you might run into something here in chapter 24 where all he is talking about is the destruction of the temple. Or you might run into something in chapter 24 where all he is talking about is when he returns. Or you may run into something in the chapter that is just talking about judgment and the end of time. Or every now and then you may run into something in chapter 24 where he's actually talking about multiple ones of those at the same time. And that's where it gets kind of complicated. So as I said, we will not explain everything this morning because it can't be done, but we'll do the best we can with what we've got. So Jesus gives many answers. First of all, in verse 4 and 5, Jesus answered them and says, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." So his first answer is, don't be led astray. There are always going to be people that come along and try to give you bad information. David was talking this morning in Bible class about the story of the woman at the well who had these 5 husbands and was with a man that was not even currently her husband. And all this stuff that was going on in her life, and I would imagine at points in life, she had been led astray in one way or another. I would imagine as we sat through our marriage seminar yesterday, there were those of us that as things came along that they explained, they seemed so clear and so obvious to us that at some point in our marriages we had been led in a different direction than that direction. In our lives, when it comes to our walk with Christ, there are some times where we have listened to the wrong voice. You ever been there? Have you ever had that time where you really thought, this person that I'm following along with, they are really a good person to mentor me, to lead me, and somewhere along the way you realize you're listening to the wrong voice? Or in our nation right now, I think we have plenty of examples of people who are following the wrong voices, going in the wrong way. And so Jesus' first warning here, this first answer to the question is, don't be led astray. And then in verse 6, he says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. You've heard this one before, haven't you? You've heard this pointed in all kinds of directions. See to it that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And I have seen, and maybe you have also, this Ukraine stuff going on the other side of the world, Russia and Ukraine. Have you not already seen someone try to connect this to end times? Have you not seen someone try to say, look at what's happening there, and because of that, then we know this is coming? And what Jesus is really saying is, normal things are going to be going on. Because wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines and all of that, is there one point in history that you can point to where that's all happening? Or is that happening all throughout history? Russell encouraged us this morning, the idea of remembering history. We see these things all the time. Try to think of a time where there was not a war going on somewhere. Try to think of a time where there was, if there wasn't a war going on, was there not a rumor of one on the way? Think of a time where natural disasters were not going on. Every time one happens nowadays, what do we hear? End of time, we hear climate change, we hear all kinds of things. These things always happen. They're always part of what goes on in our world. And so Jesus says, all of these things that are going on, it's going to be like normal life. And it may not be happening in your place, but you'll know what's happening over here or over there. And so as these things are happening, it's still coming. There's still something that's coming behind it. Then if you skip down to verse 9, it says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And once again, as he writes, talking about things that are coming their way before the destruction of the temple in AD 70, does this not sound like the world in which we live? That there's going to be hatred because of what we do. There's going to be all of this just discord going on. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. And so he says normal things are going to be happening, and it's not going to be easy to follow. It is not going to be easy to be a Christian in the midst of all of this. And maybe you feel like you're there too. We know the right things to do. We know the right way to stand. And sometimes that just feels very difficult for us to do in one way or another. And so what we tend to do is go to the extremes. There's this thing within our nature that takes us there. So we do one of two things. Either we just cower in a corner frightened by all of this and we don't say anything, or we are such jerks about it that no one can stand to be around us. And we cannot seem to find the in-between of standing on what Jesus has taught, but doing that in a loving way. As Peter would write about in his letter, be ready to give reason for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect in 1 Peter 3:15. We want to be people who are saying and doing the things of Jesus, but also acknowledging it's not going to be easy. And we talk a lot when we try to get people to that relationship with Christ about all of the good that comes with it, the church family and the encouragement and the not being alone and heaven and all of that stuff. And all of that is true, but there's a difficult side as well. And Jesus says when all of these things are going on, people are not going to like you because they're going to feel like you are part of the problem. And because of that, there are going to be a lot of people that walk away. And I think we can acknowledge that to be true too, can we not? We have known a lot of people that when it gets hard, they walk away. And for us, the temptation may be there, but we are to stand firm also. In verse 13, it says that, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. So he says the perseverance, that's going to be worthwhile. Even when it gets difficult, even when people hate you because of it, if you will persevere, there will be a reward that comes with that, both in being with one another and being with Him, and in the eternity that is to come. And so all of these things that are so difficult in life, if we can just stand through all of that, we will be in a better place with Him. So then, now if it's not complicated already, it really gets complicated here in verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation, which sounds like it should be one of the bad guys in a superhero movie nowadays, but you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. When you see the most complicated thing I've said, let the reader understand. So we've got this abomination that causes desolation. And everybody gets caught up on here on what is he talking about. People turn back to Daniel, to your cross-references, and try to figure out what this is. Most people seem to think this is something that deals with the destruction of the temple that's going to come in AD 70. And they will look at this through a few lenses. The first idea is in AD 40, Caligula, who is synonymous with everything bad nowadays, the way we use that term. Caligula is one who, as a Roman ruler, decided, what would be a good idea if we took this temple of the Jews and we've already got this nice shiny building that's there and there's all this space, let's set up some altars there to our pagan gods. They've already done the trouble of building. We'll just add an altar to pagan gods there. Now this was his plan, but it never happened. Whether God causes that not to happen or it just doesn't happen because of the turn of events, who knows? But it doesn't happen. Or when you come along to AD 66, there's an uprising of revolutionaries and priests are killed within the temple. And what we know about from Levitical law especially, but with the shedding of human blood, there is an uncleanness there, a defiling of the temple that would happen that is not fixable. And so the temple is now a place that is unclean in the eyes of God for this period of time. Or, if we know history, when we get to AD 70, there's the destruction of the temple. There are those that think it's the moment where everything is surrounded, where they have encircled the city and the temple, and that is the abomination. But all of the commentators seem to lean toward the idea that this is all about the destruction of the temple. And the reason beyond that, if you can't agree with that with history and with Daniel and with prophecy and all of that, is what happens in the next verse. In the next verse, he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So his advice here, his answer to the question here is, run. Now, if this is about the end of the world, and if this is about judgment or him returning to earth, is running going to do you any good? It's not. And let me let you in on a hint here, if that's your escape plan. If you think, I'll live however I'm going to live, and when he comes back or when Judgment Day comes, I'm just going to run. Jonah tried that once long ago. It didn't work out for him. And I will guarantee you, when the end of everything comes, running is not an option. So when he says in verse 15, run, what he's talking about here is the destruction of the temple. So again, he flips back and forth between answers to the different questions. Then down to verse 23, he says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Now, he's already warned a little bit about this idea of not following the wrong people. Here he says, you're going to know. When he returns, you're going to know. There's not going to be any doubt. When Jesus shows up, there's not going to be people gathered around questioning, was that Jesus that just came back? You're going to know. This lightning that comes, there is not a way to replicate this other than it being him. And so many times what people are worried about is, well, what is this sign, and there are wars and rumors of wars, and these people are prophesying this, or as we've had even in recent history in our world. I can think back probably about 20 years now, there was a religious cult that thought the comet that had come was the sign, that it was going to be the end of time, and they all gathered preparing for that. There was not long ago a time where I believe it was the Mayan calendar that ran out. It was either the Mayans or the Incans. Their calendar ran out, and everybody assumed that the day that the calendar ran out, that it was all going to end. And I have always, because of reading scriptures like this, thought to myself, the day that everybody is saying is going to be the day is probably the one day you can count on it not being the day. Because nobody's going to know. And so he says, when I come, you're going to know. And then he says, as we read at the beginning here, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Only one knows the time. We can get together and talk about it. We can try to decide what he's talking about here and in Revelation and other places, most of which tend to point toward the destruction of the temple, or at least just the ideas of what's coming, not so much a sign of if you see this, this, and this, then you'll know it's time. Only God knows. And when he says that, by the way, he's saying he doesn't even know. It is only the Father who knows these things. And then he says in verses 42 and 43, therefore, because of everything I've told you at this point, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. So his last answer to the question is to be ready. You need to be ready, because as he says in the following verse, therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. So not only is it something where we're not going to have a lot of signs to prepare us, we're not going to have this thing we can check off where this has happened, and this has happened, and now we can know it's time. It's going to come at a time that we do not expect. We had this seminar last week, and as we were planning this months ago, Trey, who was part of the group that did our seminar, he and his wife, he talked to us about having a registration form and how we need to have registration so we will know lots of things. He said, we're going to have workbooks for this, and we didn't know how many workbooks do we bring, what are we prepared for? You may have, as we had yesterday morning, coffee and donuts. You're going to have that. How much coffee and donuts do you want to get? You're going to have Thorin, who's going to be setting up all this childcare. How many kids are there going to be? What do you expect? And I will tell you there is a wisdom in that, because you don't want to show up here on Friday evening expecting 50 people and finding 150 people, because you're not ready with all the books you need and all the snacks you need and all the childcare people you need and all of those things. And we're geared in that way. And so we're geared in such a way that says, okay, I want to know this, and I want to know this, and I want to know this, so I can know what to do and when to do it. And God knows that about us, by the way, because he has designed us with that inside us. He has designed us as people that need to know things. Even the spontaneous among us, there are things we want to know. There are things we want to be prepared for. And so what he tells us is, you cannot rest on the timing of this. You just have to be ready. So if you sit here this morning, or if you're watching online, you cannot rest on, I am going to live life in this way to this point, and then when this day comes, I'm going to fix it. And then everything's going to be good. I was always bothered as a youth minister. I don't know if any of our folks have done this along the way. I was always bothered as a youth minister when one of our teens would come to me in February. And they would say to me, you know, we've been talking about baptism, and I feel like I really need to be baptized. I feel like I really want to follow Jesus. And we're having camp in June. And I love camp, and I'm going to be baptized at camp in June. Or they would say, my grandparents are coming to visit this summer in July, and I'm going to be baptized this summer in July when they're here. And I would always say to them, didn't you just finish telling me you're ready to be baptized? Why wait? Why wait for June? Why wait for July? And I'm not a fire insurance kind of guy. That's not the way I view baptism. But at the same time, I think to myself, how many of us are thinking, when I do these things, then I will do this. When I get these things in order, then I will do this. I think of the story David shared with us this morning about the woman at the well. What if her thinking is, when I get all of this man trouble fixed, then I will follow? Instead, what do we find her doing in the story? She goes back to town and she tells people, this is a guy who knows everything. I think I've met the Messiah out here. Her life is changed in that instant. And Jesus says to his followers as they're here, your life has already been changed. Be ready for what's coming. And then he follows, by the way, and we won't look at this story, but he follows, by the way, with a very familiar story to a lot of us in chapter 25 of these virgins waiting for a wedding with their lamps, and 5 are prepared with extra oil and 5 are not. And if you are not ready, then when the feast comes, when the judgment comes, when the end comes, there's a risk there. And so the question for us is, are we ready this morning? Are you ready? And if you're not, what are you waiting for? Because I will tell you, whatever it is you have convinced yourself, you have to do this first. Do this first instead, and then do that. You can confess his name this morning, you can be baptized, and whatever that thing is that you are struggling with, you can then begin to work on that thing. Whatever that thing is you think I've got to have fixed first, you can then fix that thing. I knew a lady one time that said she wanted to read through the entire Bible first. I said, that is a good goal, and I'm glad you want to do that, but you can keep reading it. If you know it's time, if you've gotten to that part of the Bible where it talks about this and you know it's time, you can continue reading after you come up out of the water. Whatever that thing is that you're thinking, I've got to fix this first, you do not have to fix that first. What we find in Scripture is not oftentimes what we encourage people to do. We tend to tell people, we tend to show people somehow, you got to get these things in order and then you can follow Jesus. What we find in people, in Scripture, is people that are a mess. We find people whose lives are completely out of order. And what do? They follow Jesus and they begin to get their lives in order. So this morning, if you are not ready, get ready to follow him today. Because we know the end is near. We don't know when it is. It's not based on somebody's calendar from hundreds of years ago. It's not based on all those signs somewhere along the way. It is based on the fact that God has a plan for when this will come, and it could be before we leave here today, or it could be long after we're all gone from here on earth. But the end will come, and you need to be ready for him. Come to this morning, come back to him, whatever you need to do. Please come while we stand and sing.